You know, it's been so cold outside, I actually saw a politician with his hands in his own pockets. You know, the problem with political jokes is that someday they get elected.
Oh.
But not Alexander Hamilton. He was not elected, he was appointed. But I will get to that. After that great introduction by Jerry, I'd like to go ahead and start his life right where Jerry left off. One of the problems that we had in our republic when it was first founded, it was not remedied until the 12th Amendment. And when the electors voted for who was going to be president and who was going to be vice president, there was no way to vote as a block. They voted for whoever they wanted, and if both parties, or the vice president and the president, ended up with both votes, it could end up being a disaster. This is what prompted a problem that John Adams had with Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton wanted Washington to be president, and his vice president was going to be John Adams. But when John Adams heard that Alexander Hamilton was secretly going around asking several of the electors to withhold their votes, he did it because he needed to in order to make sure that Washington would end up as president and John Adams would end up as vice president. But this infuriated John Adams, and he never forgave him. This was the beginning in 1789 of a feud that would end up preventing Alexander Hamilton from becoming a politician who was elected as our president, one of a couple reasons. So, one of the things that I like about Alexander Hamilton, I found from reading this great book, by the way, this is really a barnstorming, page-turner book here that I recommend that you all go and get. They actually did a play on this that brings some of this information out for you guys to see if you don't like reading. But for those of us who like to read, here's another fact I found out about Hamilton. He collected no income when he was in office. Unlike some people nowadays who enrich themselves to the tune of $31 million contributions to their foundations in order to give 50% of the uranium to the Russians, he was not doing stuff like this. He severed all income, and they didn't pay people a lot back then. Most of the people who served were rich and had slaves and could survive off of not making much money. He ended up poor. One of the things he did in office when he was serving under President Washington is President Washington was a great figurehead. He was a great uniter of the country, and he had great judgment, but he delegated a lot. And one of the persons that he delegated the most to was Alexander Hamilton. So as Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton was in charge of devising most of what we now find non-exceptional, common, and taken for granted, but at the time was very confrontational. We had to argue it all through. Customs duties. The only way to pay off all of that taxes that were required for the assumption of the debt that the states incurred in order to win the war was by collecting customs duties. So he would establish a Coast Guard. He'd have people go and inspect every ship that came in. He would assess what the value of it is and collect some duties based on that value. So he had to organize the whole Coast Guard, get customs duties, and collect taxes. He also established a mint. Prior to that time, everybody was using multiple currencies. And you had Spanish, hard metal currency, you had British currency, everyone was using non-American currency. Once he established a bank, there could be one uniform currency. He funded the debt through the bank. And at that time, nobody had bookkeeping. So he had to devise the entire science of bookkeeping. The accountants today use the same type of system in the Treasury that he first instituted, which is double account bookkeeping. You take money out of one account and put it into another, you make two entries. It's double entry bookkeeping. He designed it. And once he got people believing in the power of the United States to actually pay their bills, then they were able to institute paper money. If you look at a dollar bill, you will see this can be exchanged for cash. This can be exchanged for metal money. It says that right on our currency. That made people honest. They couldn't go and just print huge amounts of paper money without it being related to the actual hard money currency that was in existence. This is all stuff we take for granted now. But when you read this, you figure out who designed it. and you find out that he designed it. Now, why was the assumption so important? When he had the federal government assume all of those debts, why was that so important to the Southerners that they be located in Washington, D.C.? If you look at who a lot of the people who were to become future presidents, both President Washington, Thomas Jefferson, a lot of the people who founded the Constitution, John Monroe, they were all slave holders. They were all from the South. And they were already anticipating that they were going to have problems extending slavery. There was a huge antagonism that started to develop even at that early point in the country between the Northerners, who wanted machinery and factories and industrial workers and cities and banks, versus plantation owners, those who were agrarian, those who owned slaves. And they knew that if the power were evenly balanced, the balance of power would be a peaceful type of situation. So they wanted the capital closer to the South, where they could influence and keep the slavery in existence versus the growing power of the North and the banks and the merchant class and the industrialization that was going on, that started in Great Britain and started moving over here into America. And 3/4 of our trade was with Great Britain, those that we had just fought and beaten in the war. So a lot of people who didn't like Alexander Hamilton's centralization policies and his pro-business policies started accusing him of secretly wanting to sell out our country to the British, of being a secret monarch. And unfortunately, he played into their hands in a couple instances. When he was first arguing about the Constitution, one of the speeches he said is that we might benefit from an elected monarchy as our president. And he was never able to live that speech down. Anytime, it was supposed to be a secret thing that was never divulged to anybody, but anytime somebody wanted to slash him and burn him to the ground, that always seemed to be dragged up that he was secretly trying to take over as king. Now here's something interesting. You have all of that debt that needs to be paid off. He established a sinking fund to actually pay off 5% of our debt. Now, isn't that an amazing concept? Because over the last 20 years, we've seen our debt rise from $10 trillion to $20 trillion, $10 trillion of it just in the last 8 years. There was no sinking fund. There was the ever-expanding, doubling the debt fund. How are we going to pay it off? It's going to cost $2 billion a day to pay it off. And $10 trillion is worth $30,000 to each man, woman, and child here in America. So for me, as a father of 6 and a wife, that's 8 times 30. There's $240,000 in debt that was thrown onto my back in the last 8 years. But it wouldn't have been if Alexander Hamilton was in charge. He's a mensch. He actually pays debts down instead of increasing them. So another person he ran into and had problems with was Jefferson. Now, Jefferson is known for doing 2 really good things in our history. One was the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that, he authored it, everyone thinks of it as beautiful. I mean, it's called the liberal scripture by many people. And also the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase took place in 1803. And here's an interesting way to realize how great that was. For $15 million, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States. And to put it in contrast, the first bank that was founded and capitalized by Alexander Hamilton took $10 million to capitalize. So basically the first bank, 1.5 times the amount that was used to capitalize the first bank was used to buy all of that area. So I mean, that was a great price. Even at today's price, I think it comes to 43 cents an acre. So tremendous value there for Thomas Jefferson stepping up. Now, how is that possible? Thomas Jefferson loved the French. He absolutely loved it. He would get into fights with Alexander Hamilton, who he claimed loved the British. And because our trading partner was primarily British and we're getting 3/4 of our excise taxes from the British, there is truth to that. So Jefferson was in favor of the French Revolution until it turned violent. And even then he was pretty much in favor of it because he just couldn't wrap himself around the fact that all this violence was necessary. The French Revolution was about 1790. And as it started getting worse and worse and worse, America got caught between the warring powers. We had Jay's Treaty, which was signed by John Adams, and he caught a bunch of flack for it because he basically conceded to the British after the British had confiscated 250 of our merchant vessels. They impressed them. They basically said, okay, well, if you're going to try and be neutral, and we're in war with France, we're just going to go steal all of your merchant vessels and take it and convert them into our fleet and use it to fight the French. And if you don't like it, tough luck. And so Jay's Treaty went and said, okay, well, we don't really like it, but you at least have to buy all the stuff that was in the ships and give us some money back. So John Adams got a bunch of flack for that, and that was something that Alexander Hamilton pointed out. He was very angry with that treaty. But one of the things that John Adams did that was really good is he ended up preventing a war with France. The war with France almost broke out about 3 years later when France said, well, if you're going to sign Jay's Treaty and allow them to steal 250 of your ships, we're going to steal 300 of your ships. We're going to confiscate all of those cargo. And what are you going to do about it? You're going to sign some wimpy little treaty like Jay's Treaty with us? Well, in fact, that's what John Adams did. He kept us out of war. But at the time, Alexander Hamilton was saying, look at what the French are doing. They're stealing all of our ships. They're treating us like crap. Let's have a standing army. And the American public agreed with that. And so he ended up volunteering to lead it, which fed into the whole narrative that he wanted to basically become a dictator, take over the country, and become king. So he didn't do it himself. He said, well, we trust, and everybody trusts George Washington. Well, George Washington in charge, and George said, yeah, I'll do it. But who do I need as my chief of staff? Oh, the same guy who helped me win the Revolutionary War. We'll have Alexander Hamilton as my chief of staff, and we'll give him a promotion up to brigadier general. So he ended up becoming a brigadier general, jumping ahead of 3 or 4 other people in line, and John Adams didn't like it because he didn't like the competition, even though they were both in the Federalist Party. And Thomas Jefferson hated it because he was all for France. So now we start seeing some of the dynamic of the Founding Fathers, and they were not nice about their disagreements. They each had their own newspapers that would vilify each other. And at this point, they started digging through all of Alexander Hamilton's really dirty laundry. Alexander Hamilton had an affair with a 23-year-old when he was 33. Her name was Maria Reynolds. And it all started off with Maria Reynolds coming to his office and saying, oh, I'm poor, I'm destitute, my husband has left me, I'm about ready to go on welfare, I really could use some money, and by the way, you know, I haven't had any marital relations in such a long, long time. I'm so desperate, I would do just about anything just so I don't end up on welfare. Well, dumbass fell for that. And so he said, well, my wife's at home, but I'll tell you what, I'll come visit you at your place tomorrow with some money. And as he started to feed his addiction, he eventually found out that it was all a ruse from some con artists. The husband was in on the whole thing and using it to basically blackmail him because pretty soon the money had to keep coming or they were going to run to the papers and tell everybody about what a shyster he was and an adulterer and so forth. So this affair goes on for 3 or 4 years, and then Thomas Jefferson learns about it, and James Monroe, and they all swear that they're going to be gentlemen and not let it hit the fan, but in fact it does. So he ends up squandering his moral authority. That's one of the big reasons that prevented him from ever becoming president. But around the time also that he was in favor of a standing army, and he wanted to prevent the French from taking over, John Adams signs this agreement with the French and says, okay, we're diffusing the issue. We're not going to have war with the French. And Alexander Hamilton was so incensed that his time for military glory was being taken away from him that he published a pamphlet in which he attacked his own Federalist president and started talking about how John Adams was a nutcase. He had a temper tantrums. He was great one day and was crazy the next day and was always absent from the job and running back to Boston all the time and not really doing what he's supposed to in his cabinet, and how at first he was against the French and now he's for it, and what's the matter with him? And then, unlike what Alexander Hamilton used to do, which is to publish everything under a pseudonym, he published it under his own name. So now that's 2 strikes against him. One is the affair, and the second one is attacking his own president. Mitt Romney did something recently. What's interesting when you read about this stuff is you can see parallels to today. And Mitt Romney didn't end up getting the Secretary of State position because too many people held it against him that he had attacked the soon-to-be president-elect. So you can go through history and say, I've seen that before. Where have I seen that before? A couple other things that Alexander Hamilton did is one of the biggest inventions of this era was a flax mill. And that was a way, it was like a way to pick cotton without having thousands and thousands of slaves pick out all of the seeds. And this was developed by the Great Britain Arkwright, was his name. Well, somebody stole those designs, brought it to America, made some slight deviations, and Alexander Hamilton said, great, you now have a patent. Good for you. We're going to take whatever technology we can get our hands on. So that's something to remember nowadays too, because our president-elect is criticizing China for stealing all of our patents, taking all of our information, and reverse engineering all of our great ideas. This is the chickens coming home to roost. But I'm pro-America, so forget what I just said. Those evil Chinese, we're going to go get them and give them what they deserve. So what are the advantages of a central bank? You get to expand the money supply, you get to extend credit to government and business, you get to collect revenues, you get to make debt payments, and you can handle foreign exchange, and all of the taxes that you do collect you get to deposit. These are all advantages we know about central banks, but it would be impossible to be a tax collecting entity without having something in place like the bank that functions exactly like the bank. And in another book I'm reading which talks about the Industrial Revolution, you can't finance canals, you can't finance infrastructure, highways, better roads without having the ability to float a bond and sell it to people. Banks did that. Nowadays Wall Street does it with investment banks. In the old days, investment banks were just part of normal banks. So if you want to expand, if you want to finance the industry in our society, you need to have the bank. How did Alexander Hamilton make sure that the bank wasn't disassembled? Well, you remember when I talked about the 12th Amendment and how it solved the problem eventually with John Adams and Washington? Well, guess who else had that problem? Thomas Jefferson ran and had an equal amount of votes with his vice president, Aaron Burr. Equal number. It took 35 votes to break the tie. And the reason that the tie was broken in favor of Thomas Jefferson was because Alexander Hamilton hated him less than Aaron Burr. So he said to Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to get people to support you, but the cost for my support is you keep that bank in place. You're going to keep it. And he knew that Thomas Jefferson, once he got in office, even though he was an advocate for smaller government and limited government, would be just like President Obama, who railed against the Patriot Act until he got into office. And like most politicians who love power, once they talk about limited power until they get it, and once they get it, they don't want to give it up. That was the same thing that happened with Thomas Jefferson, forced into it, of course, by Alexander Hamilton. So, what happens at the end of his life? Aaron Burr hates him. He knows he could have been president if it wasn't for Alexander Hamilton. So when he can't become president, because Thomas Jefferson hates him too, because he was supposed to be vice president, not running for his job. So nobody in his own party likes him. He runs over to New York to try and become governor. Alexander Hamilton makes sure he doesn't become governor. So at that point, Aaron Burr challenges him to a duel. And here's the bad part. Well, there's a lot of bad parts. But just a couple years earlier, his oldest son had also been in a duel and died defending his father. And he foolishly told his son, because gentlemen did this type of thing, it was like a game of chicken. And you all tried to prove your masculinity by entering a duel without actually shooting or killing the other person, because then you could go to jail, it would stain your reputation. So you pretty much had the option to fire towards the guy without hitting him to each retain your honor. It was sort of similar to what the French used to do when they would wave their swords at each other and scratch up each other's faces. That was considered brave, but if you actually put out the other person's eyeball, then you weren't that good of a fencer, because that really wasn't the rules of the duel. So foolishly, Philip went into this thinking that's what this duel was all about, and he ends up dead. His father ends up going into the duel a couple years later with Aaron Burr, uses the same strategy, and ends up dead. I will end with a short letter to his wife that he gave to her, well, somebody else gave to her after his death. This letter, my dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall first have terminated my earthly career, to begin, as I humbly hope, from redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem. I need not tell you of the pangs I feel from the idea of quitting you and exposing you to the anguish which I know you would feel. Nor could I dwell on this topic lest it should unman me. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children from me. Ever yours, Alexander Hamilton.
Well done.